Hello there, and welcome to our special coverage of the Russia-Ukraine file. The fighting in Ukraine marked its 47th day, and the world is still trying to find an ultimate solution to Russia-Ukraine war that has seen thousands of dead, millions displaced, and multiple cities wrecked. When Russia's President Vladimir Putin sent its troops to Ukraine, there was nothing to suggest a time frame within which he wanted to achieve his goals. Right now, Ukraine is in fact retaking territories as Russia seems to abandon its operation in the north and moves to the east, where its complete focus lies. Russia's invasion has pushed Zelensky deeper into the embrace of the West that has ensured Ukraine is more weaponized. This is what Putin was most upset about from the very beginning. But where is this going? These questions and more will be discussed with our panel of guests. Joining us on our show today, Manuel Pouchlet, from Paris, lecturer and geopolitical analyst. And from Kiev, we have Denis Berktay, a Turkish journalist in Ukraine, expert on Eastern Europe. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. The show begins right after this break. Before we delve into any discussion, let's share with you live updates about the Russia-Ukraine. Ukraine says 10 humanitarian corridors to evacuate people from besieged regions have been agreed for Saturday. The Welt am Sonntag newspaper, citing the Germany's interior minister, reports that Berlin has started working on strengthening its basement shelters as well as building up crisis stocks in case of a war. Luhansk Governor Serhiy Gray says more evacuations are needed from the region as shelling has increased in recent days and more Russian forces have been arriving. Russia continues its hit Ukrainian non-combatants, such as the civilians killed in Friday's rocket strike on Kramatorsk railway station in eastern Ukraine, according to British military intelligence. The Institute for the Study of War says Ukrainian forces are continuing to hold out against Russian attacks in eastern and southwestern Mariupol, which has been besieged for weeks. So, amid all the allegations against Russia attacking civilians, Mr. Emmanuel Pouchlet, why does Russia keep attacking non-combatants despite opening many humanitarian corridors lately? Or are these just false accusations to escalate the situation even further and get the support Ukraine is seeking from NATO? How do you see this?
So, according to the pictures, the latest images we saw on our screen or TV programs recently concerning Russian attacking civilians, it sounds to all tactics and techniques to destabilize the world opinion. And that's why it has become dangerous to give you a feedback about this, because we need time to interpret what is going on the ground. Concerning the population is never neutral, and attacking women and children is very hard in our societies and civilization to accept. So this is a strong message to say that the war is with death. After 42 or 43 days of war in Ukraine, this is the first pictures we saw about dead persons, I mean civilian dead persons, because at the starting of this war, we saw only soldiers. So I think it's a turning point at the moment to try to mobilize the international opinions and the international community to denounce what is going on in Ukraine.
Very nice indeed. Mr. Denis Berktay, what's your take on this? How do you see this? Accusations against Russia. Is it to escalate the situation even further and trying to seek more help perhaps from NATO?
The latest events in Ukraine, the latest allegations of genocide, for example, yes, they have hardened the position, they have hardened the negotiation process, because last week, for example, everybody was optimistic about the outcomes of the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. But after those claims, now it became a bit harder. Furthermore, as some Turkish politicians also emphasize, in my opinion, the Western world, especially the United States, also doesn't want a quick solution of that problem, I suppose. For this reason, now the situation is a bit harder. The peace negotiation process is also now in trouble, I think. I can give more detailed answers to your subsequent questions.
Yes, very nice. What about you, Manuel Puschle? Talking about Germany and the article of the Welt am Sonntag newspaper, why is Germany preparing for a war? Is it based on the fear of Russia seeking more expansion after Ukraine, such as Poland, which is worried to be the next target? Or Germany is just expecting another world war scenario?
So according to Germany, the position of Germany is very different from the one we have in France, because Ukraine represents past and specific history with the German history, of course. And Germany is pushing up diplomacy because it has German minorities in Ukraine. So this is one topic that we don't know, in fact, for a lot of viewers, and it's very important to take into account. And concerning Poland or other Eastern country, Germany is acting in influence area. So it's very important to understand that too, concerning the German position.
Mm-hmm. Very nice indeed. All right, clear enough. So let's move on to this piece of news. At least 52 people, including 5 children, have been killed and nearly 100 wounded in a rocket attack on a railway station in Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine, according to Ukrainian officials. Ukrainian officials accused Russia for the attack, saying it took place as civilians were at the station in an attempt to evacuate to safer parts of the country, while Russia denied any involvement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, "We expect a firm and international response to this war crime."
Every major state in the world has already condemned Russia's attack on Kramatorsk. We expect a firm and international response to this war crime, like the Bucha massacres, like many other Russian war crimes. Missile fire at Kramatorsk must be held back by the court, and that will happen.
Mr. Manuel Puschle, I get back to you. Ukrainian officials keep condemning and accusing Russia of attacking civilians and especially children amid evacuation operations or beyond that. Is Ukraine pursuing a strategy to put pressure on the world powers to react?
Yes, I think that today President Zelensky is conducting a communication campaign to sensibilize the international community. In fact, I think he's acting to pressure the international community to act and to be more severe against Russia. So we have to take care about this kind of strategy. Because we know that concerning France, for example, we will meet, of course, Russia in other overseas countries. I mean, concerning France, it will be Africa too. So don't forget that at the moment it's difficult to give an immediate answer about what is going on concerning Mr. Zelensky communication campaign. But the main goal is to mobilize the international community and, of course, to condemn Russian acts on this terrible war.
Nice. According to Zelensky's declarations, Mr. Denis Bakhtai, what other sanctions is the Ukrainian president expecting from the world to impose against Russia, i.e., what is still to be laid out on the table?
Well, first of all, the Ukrainian government expects full isolation, complete isolation of Russia from the financial system of the world. Completely, they urge that Russia should be completely isolated from the world financial system, first of all. Secondly, or more important, Ukraine demands closing the airspace for Russia's airplanes. But the United States, even Joe Biden, doesn't accept this. He claims that such a move would cause war between the United States and Russia. Furthermore, Zelensky now demands more weapons from the Western countries, and he says that such a move will be a real help to Ukraine at this stage. Furthermore, but I should say that during the negotiations, Zelensky, from the second day of the war, Zelensky began emphasizing accepting the status of permanently neutral state for Ukraine. It means Zelensky is ready to refuse NATO membership plan for Ukraine. He says that NATO is not ready to accept Ukraine. So he has a kind of disappointment with the behavior of the NATO states. We can also discuss about this further.
Yes, very nice. So what about you, Manuel Pouchelet? He's saying, our distinguished sec is saying that Zelensky was disappointed. Is that the case? What is he expecting more to be done?
Yes, in fact, President Zelensky is searching solutions for his country to free his country from the Russian army. Of course, but negotiating with Mr. Putin will become difficult, because if EU or NATO is committed in this war, it will be more difficult to reach negotiations and to obtain maybe satisfaction on the both sides. So this is, I think, one of the key of the problem has to be found out now. Diplomacy is running fast at the moment, and the visit of Mrs. von der Leyen in Ukraine is kind of signal to say, okay, maybe Ukraine, you will be able to join European Union, but concerning NATO, it won't be possible.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, European Union leaders visited Bucha, a town in the west of Kiev, where hundreds of civilians were allegedly killed by Russian forces, according to Ukrainian authorities. The leaders' visit aimed to provide Ukraine with moral and financial support. Let's follow this report and then we get back to the discussion.
Two top European Union officials paid a visit to Ukraine on Friday to express support with the country after Russian military withdrew from the area around Kiev. During a visit to the village where scientific investigators began exhuming victims from a mass grave, von der Leyen appeared obviously disturbed by what she observed in the village, where Ukrainian officials claim Russian forces massacred hundreds of civilians. President of the European Commission handed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a questionnaire that might serve as the basis for an application to join the EU. Many countries in Eastern Europe support Ukraine's membership in the EU, but senior Western officials are hesitant.
Ukraine belongs to the European family. We've heard your request loud and clear. And today we're here to give you a first positive answer. In this envelope, dear Volodymyr, there is an important step towards EU membership.
I'm very grateful for your visit today and trip to Bucha. It is a very strong signal that Ukraine and the European Union are together in the struggle for justice, dignity, and the value of our lives.
During the conference, Zelensky reiterated his desire for tougher Russian sanctions.
I ask you to help us with the sanctions. They must only increase, otherwise, Russia will not listen to anyone.
The EU is about to impose a ban on Russian coal imports, and a possible second step of prohibiting oil deliveries will be debated on Monday. New penalties were also accepted by EU leaders, prohibiting the import of billions of dollars worth of wood, chemicals, and other products from Russia. However, Zelensky believes the restrictions should be harsher. Ursula von der Leyen and Josep Borrell are the most senior European delegation to visit Kiev since the beginning of the Russian military operation, and their visit aimed at providing moral and financial support to Zelensky.
Following this report, Mr. Manuel Pouchelet, do you think the EU's visit to Bucha can boost Ukraine's chance to join the EU soon? Is it another strategy? Because if Ukraine is part of the EU, Russia's attack on its own attack against the EU, and hence the direct clash supposedly Western leaders were trying to avoid at the beginning. Meaning, if Ukraine is part of the EU, any attack from Russia to Ukraine or against Ukraine will be considered an attack against the EU.
Yes, it is. It will become a legal problem, in fact. Greeting a new member who is under attack, I think, is not a good strategy. The first step is to have peace and to understand what was going on in this area. Of course, Ukraine is a member of Europe, I mean, with a geographical aspect. On starting negotiations to integrate the European Union, is a good signal of opening the union on its eastern part. But what will be the position of Moscow? Do you think that Mr. Putin will accept this? I think maybe it could be also a bridge too far in this affair. So maybe Mrs. von der Leyen is going too fast, and it will require a long period of mining up some approaches, So that is the big challenge at the moment concerning European Union. It's also a way to overpass the American solutions too, to show that Europe is able to solve problems and find out solutions on its own territory. I mean the geographical territory. So it's also a message addresses to Washington.
Very nice. What about you, Mr. Dennis? Needless to speak about the arms deliveries that these nations or Western nations keep sending to Ukraine. How do you see their help? Although they are trying to avoid a direct, let's say, clash with Russia, their arms are still being delivered to Ukraine. And if we assume Ukraine would join the EU, what would be the expected outcome?
Well, first of all, about your second question, I don't see that there's a high possibility for Ukraine to be a member of the EU in the near future. I don't. Not only I say this, but many European politicians say this. Clear enough, they say this. But in Ukraine, especially in the pro-Western circles in Ukraine, many times they create some kind of illusions. Such kinds of illusions were both during the Orange Revolution of 2004 and during the Second Revolution of 2014. I was in Ukraine at that time, and during this war. And according to this illusion, as if the EU is ready to accept Ukraine directly tomorrow. But this is not true, and the EU officials said that Ukraine is a part of the European family. This is one thing, but accepting Ukraine as a full member to the European Union, it is another, because Ukraine has lots of problems, and to be realistic, it's not such a quick issue. And Ukraine is just now becoming a candidate state. Well, Turkey also became a candidate state about 20 years ago, so it doesn't have any meaning. On the other hand, about the help of the Western states to Ukraine, but we can see that yes, they are sending arms to Ukraine, but on the other hand, only Ukrainian soldiers die in this war. And on the other hand, some Western politicians, especially British and American politicians, they say this: yes, Ukraine will soon win the war. It should continue fighting, etc. So they are urging Ukraine to fight in this war. So Ukrainian people will die. Ukrainian people will migrate to the European states, and already more than 4 million people. It's 1/10 of the population of Ukraine. They have left their countries, and how many of them will return back? It's yet unknown. So there is such a tragedy, but American and British politicians continue urging them to continue fighting.
Yes, but what is the interest of Western nations if Ukraine continues fighting? There is a lot of suffering. Ukrainian citizens and civilians are suffering. Russian civilians are suffering. I mean, when it's a war scenario, we see that common people suffer the consequences. But who is actually winning this war? And who benefits from this war lingering on, Mr. Dennis?
I can say that waging such a war, attacking Ukraine, it was a fatal mistake of Vladimir Putin, I think. And it's such a great mistake that he wouldn't have made this, for example, some 5 or 10 years ago, but remaining so long in power has misled him, I think. In this situation, Russia also loses because Russia also loses many things. Ukraine also loses its people, its infrastructure. Both Russia and Ukraine loses everything. So a quick peace will be in the interests of both Russia and Ukraine and of the whole Black Sea region. However, in this situation, for example, in my opinion, the United States, by attracting Russia into the war, it helps Russia lose its sources. On the other hand, because in this situation, Russia meets with very harsh sanctions of the whole Western world. And one of the greatest mistakes of Vladimir Putin was by waging this war, he united the whole Western world before himself. Because previously the Russian diplomacy was trying to avoid from a unification union of the French-German axis on the one hand, and on the other hand, the British-American axis. They were trying to separate them from each other, but they made them united against Russia. So in this situation, the Biden administration, in my opinion, they provoked this situation a lot. So in this situation, Russia loses its sources in Ukraine, and Ukraine also loses lots of things. But on the other hand, the United States and Britain, they will be able to get rid of one of their rivals, Russia. So in this situation, continuing war, it's not in the interests of the Eastern European nations, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely, especially that they are dependent on Russian energy products as well. Okay, thank you indeed. Moving on, among new sanctions against Moscow, Japan announced that it will give up on Russian coal and that it was also going to expel 8 Russian diplomats. These announcements follow a series of similar measures in Europe, with Ukraine's allies increasing pressure on Moscow following allegations of massacres of civilians by Russian troops in the Kiev region. Let's take a listen.
Russian troops have killed civilians and attacked nuclear facilities, which is a serious violation of international humanitarian law. These are unforgivable war crimes. We will ban the importation of Russian coal. We will adopt alternatives by gradually reducing imports. We will reduce our energy dependence on Russia.
I get back to you, Mr. Denis, since we lost Manuel Pushlet over Skype. We're going to try to reach him again. When we see the expansion of sanctions over Russia's economy, Mr. Denis, how will this affect Russia even more? Is there a way for Russia to turn around these sanctions and implement perhaps other measures to survive and overcome no matter what, especially that it has allies such as China and other countries?
Well, on the one hand, the Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, on the first day of the war, stated that just before the war, after the Russian President Vladimir Putin recognized the breakaway regions of Donbass, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic as independent states, the next day, the Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin said that Russia had been well prepared for the sanctions of the Western states. For half year, for 6 months before the war, they prepared for those sanctions, he announces. On the other hand, those ruling circles in Russia, they also say that Russia cooperates well with the People's Republic of China, with some other states, and their economies are now the total population of those countries are much bigger than the Western world. But I think that in this situation, Russia's economy will, of course, suffer from those sanctions in the long time.
Mm-hmm. And how far do you think Russia will hold against these continuous sanctions? Is there a possibility to turn around it? I mean, yes, maybe the consequences could appear on the long run, but Vladimir Putin himself announced that his country is willing to move towards self-sufficiency. How successful do you think he will be?
Well, on this long-term outcomes in Russian economy, it will be hard for me to make some predictions, but I can tell in this way, I can give such an answer. This situation, the Ukrainian question is quite important for Russia. Why? Because of some reasons. First of all, Russian nationalists claim that their nation origins from Kiev. They claim that Kiev was the first capital of the Russians in the history. So Kiev has a historical importance for Russian nationalists. Furthermore, the biggest Russian Orthodox monastery is located in Kiev, the Kiev Pecharsk Monastery. So Kiev has a great religious importance for Russians as well. And thirdly, Kiev and Ukraine has a great strategical importance for Russia. And why it has such a great importance? President Vladimir Putin explained this last year in a few words. He said that in the case that Ukraine will be accepted to NATO, then NATO missile systems, which will be launched to Kharkov, for example, to the Kharkov region of Ukraine, if they fire, then a NATO missile may fall into Moscow within 7 or 10 minutes. So they don't want to allow Ukraine to be a full member of NATO, or they didn't want to allow foundation of any American military bases in Ukraine. So this is a very quite sensitive issue of Ukraine for Russia. But however, Putin pursued this policy not in an irrational way. He shouldn't have waged this war. It is another issue. But in this case, first of all, Ukrainian issue is important. Is very important for the Russian administration. First of all. Secondly, once they have begun waging a war, now they should end this in a way that could save their images. For Putin himself, in order to remain in power. So he will try to wage the war, but he will also try to make peace. For this reason, the Russian administration began to soften their demands because they met with an unexpected resistance in Ukraine within the first weeks of the war. So they began to soften their demands, expectations. So in this situation, I think that in the case that no third party provokes those sides, and if the Russian administration will become more realistic, then peace may come within 1.5 months, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. So for peace to come, technically, Ukraine has to make a lot of compromises, right, Mr. Denis? And among of these compromises, perhaps, is neutrality. And say Russia actually gets Ukraine to be neutral. Isn't this giving Russia a veto power over who can and who cannot join NATO? Are the Western nations going to accept Russia having such power, Mr. Denis?
Well, it's a hard question, but I should say that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, with the beginning of the war, began to change his stance towards NATO. As we have just talked, he on the second day of the war, he said that he is ready to discuss the question of neutrality with Russia. And he said that NATO is not rendering real support to Ukraine, and NATO is not ready to accept Ukraine as a full member. So with the beginning of the war, Zelensky began changing his stance towards this question, and this itself is a radical change in Ukraine's foreign policy. Why? Because just before the war, NATO membership question was a kind of taboo among the ruling elite of Ukraine. Although it's not a widely supported question among the Ukrainian ordinary people, the question of NATO membership. Among the ruling elite, it was a kind of taboo. So those who were questioning the necessity of NATO membership they were being accused of treason, for example. But with the beginning of the war, the situation changed. However, Russia has some unrealistic demands from Ukraine, such as recognition of annexation of Crimea by Russia. For example, this is unacceptable for Ukraine. So Russia also has to soften its demands a little bit more. So, and such a solution, for example, on Crimea and on Donbass question, such a solution could be created where both sides will ignore each other.
Thank you so much, Mr. Denis Berktay. We have come to a close, and we thank Emmanuel Pouchelet for joining us. We lost him earlier, but we joined him, and it was kind of late. Thank you, Emmanuel Pouchelet, for joining us and our talk show. Mr. Denis, thank you so much. It was very interesting exchanging views with you. With this, our special coverage draws to an end. Thank you, dear viewers, for tuning in to our channel, and bye for now.